All right, hello everyone, good evening. Thank you so much for coming out to our Tozzer book celebration for Professor Peter de Manuelian. We're so happy to have you all here. Before we get started, I just wanted to let everyone know that we'll be filming this event. And actually, Peter, did you want to let folks know what we're setting up around here?
We just have cameras everywhere, so as long as you're comfortable with that, we're good.
Yep. So these are some very cool cameras Peter has been using to film at different places. And you said the last time you used them was at a cemetery?
In Egypt, yeah. We have a looping video in the back of just some samples of a series of short videos where I'm trying to tell this story, since a 1,000-page book is maybe a little bit more than people can chew on. So eventually those will be YouTube public, and there are a couple of samples that you can see back there. Some filmed on the Harvard campus, and some out at Giza.
Yeah, and so now you'll be part of this series, maybe.
Right.
So I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Susan Gilman. I'm the director of Tozzer Library, and I'm so happy to have you here for our book celebration, How Egyptologist George Reisner Went Walking Among Pharaohs. This is our second book celebration. It's our goal to showcase anthropology scholarship and scholarship in related fields that really draws upon library and archival resources. And I'm so pleased to be celebrating Walking Among Pharaohs, George Reisner and the Dawn of Modern Egyptology, which is Peter's most recent book. And before I introduce Peter more fully, I'd like to thank all of the library staff and other staff here at Harvard who helped make this event happen. So if you give them a round of applause.
Absolutely.
Thank you, guys. And some brief logistics first. So Peter and I will have a conversation. At the end of that, we'll have time for audience questions. And then we will also have a raffle for Peter's books, signed copies, which are over there. So if you have not gotten a raffle ticket, make sure you do that at some point. Diane over there at the front has them. And so with that, I would like to introduce Peter de Manuelian, who is the Barbara Bell Professor of Egyptology in both Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations and the Anthropology Department at Harvard University. He's also the director of the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East, which is just across the street from us. We have some brochures. I highly recommend you visit it. And his Giza project at Harvard is now more than 20 years old. Previously, he was a curatorial staff at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, where he started his Giza project, and now it's at Harvard. It's more than 20 years old. The aim of the Giza project is to collect and present online all past, present, and future archaeological activity at the Giza pyramids. We do have QR codes at the tables, which take you directly to the Giza project's website, which I highly suggest you visit. It's really interesting. More recently, his Arabic Excavation Diaries project is analyzing and translating 73 handwritten Arabic diary books kept by the Egyptian foreman of the Harvard University Boston Museum of Fine Arts expedition between the years of 1913 and 1947. And we also have QR codes on the tables that link you to that project as well, and hopefully we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. His research and teaching interests include visualization and digital humanities approaches to the ancient world. Among his publications are, of course, Walking Among Pharaohs, George Reisner and the Dawn of Modern Egyptology, as well as Digital Giza, Visualizing the Pyramids, 32nd Ancient Egypt, Mastabas of Nucleus Cemetery G2100, Slabs Stelae of the Giza Necropolis, Living in the Past, Studies in Archaism of the Egyptian 26th Dynasty, and Studies in the Reign of Amenephis II. He's also written a number of children's books. So with that, please help me in welcoming Peter to join us tonight. Thank you so much for being here, Peter.
Thanks, Susan. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to Susan. Thanks to the library staff for putting this together. It's great fun to share this adventure that I've been on for the last 15 years or so in putting this book together. Around the room, they have wonderfully placed a chronological survey of Reisner's life from his senior year photo from the class of 1889 here at Harvard, his degree, his diploma, marrying the girl next door, working in Giza pyramids and also in the Sudan further, and then it goes around and there are some team photos and some other things too, and other images on the tables for you to enjoy as well. I might say just a few words of how I got into this project. I was a curator over at the Museum of Fine Arts, and the Mellon Foundation came to us and said, we have a bunch of money. Do you have anything interesting to do? And I thought, we sure do. Why don't we take the glass plate photo negatives, the excavation negatives of George Reisner's expedition, and try to scan those and put them online. But then I thought, instead of just scanning 45,000 glass plates, why not take the Giza ones and make a holistic website, try to take everything else that belongs to Giza, the diaries, the plans, the maps, the drawings, and try to unify everything. So that's how the Giza project was born in about 2000 over at the Museum of Fine Arts, and then it came over here with me to Harvard in 2010 or so. Along the way, we had tremendous helpers. Over 1,000 people to date have contributed to this project, so it's been a wonderful team effort. But I realized that we were coming across all these wonderful documents that didn't really belong on an archaeological website per se. Letters and expedition contracts and scandals and tragedies and triumphs and things. And I thought this really is a separate project, and it was time to get into George Reisner's head. This is a guy who directed this expedition for 40 plus years. He became a Harvard professor and a curator at the MFA, but he rarely came back to America. He loved being out in Egypt and living in Harvard Camp, which was just a cluster of mud brick huts behind the pyramids. And that's what he called home. He didn't have any property here, even when he came home to teach. So that was his life. And I thought, how did this happen? How did he get into archaeology in the first place? How did he raise the funds to keep things going? How did he deal with 2 world wars? And then politically, it was a real challenge too, because here's an American expat excavating in Egypt where the British are controlling the government and the French are controlling the Antiquities Service. So navigating all of those intrigues, as you can imagine, each with their own agendas, trying to make somebody look good, somebody look bad from time to time, and work with the archaeological system back then, which was called partage. It was a 50-50 division of the finds. So the Antiquities Service would come at the end of the season, say, what did you find? You'd show them, they would say, we'll take this half, you can have that half. And most of it came back to the MFA in Boston. Some of it came here to the Peabody Museum as well. So that was the deal then. For better or for worse, we have different systems now. Nothing really leaves Egypt, and the Egyptians are in control of their own government and also their own Antiquities Service as well. So times are quite different. And I learned along the way that time is so critical. I had always been trained in Egyptology, ancient Egypt, pharaonic stuff, hieroglyphs, history, archaeology. This gave me the chance to dive into 20th century Egyptian history, which was fascinating. How Cairo was ballooning, how the great Western expeditions were getting started, some of the masterpieces that we know and love so well, how they came up and are now in the Cairo Museum, discovered for the first time, the personalities involved. This is a field where the history of Egyptology, the history of the field, I find every bit as fascinating as the ancient pharaohs and the ancient history too. So mixing it all together was the goal of this book, and to try to bring this guy alive and see what made him tick and document the history of Harvard, the history of archaeology, the history of Egyptology, the personalities involved, because everybody came through eventually and met this guy. When you're on the front lines at the Giza pyramids, you have to do guest touring duty. As you see over there, there's the Queen of Belgium coming through Giza in 1930 and getting a tour from Reisner. So ups and downs, triumphs and tragedies, great discoveries, methodology, one of the first great responsible scientific archaeologists with all the documentation, which is why we have all this stuff that we do, thanks to him. And not without some colonialist and even racist tendencies at times too, that we have to acknowledge and set aside, as well as acknowledging the contributions that he made. So that's at times a delicate dance. And over the years of this project, I've seen the political atmosphere waver and change too, and I've tried to change with the times as well. And I hope it's a current piece of work that will at least give some credit on both sides of a very, very challenging issue.
Great, thank you. I'm wondering if you can take us back a bit to when Reisner was first starting out here as a student at Harvard. Originally, he wasn't studying Egyptology. He was studying Assyriology, correct?
Right. So he's from Indianapolis, did very well in school, and ended up getting accepted to Harvard. And there was no Egyptology here at all. So even if he wanted to study Egypt, he couldn't have. But it wasn't on his radar screen at all. So after a few years of undergraduate study, he ended up coming under the wing of David Gordon Lyon, the founder of our department across the street, the Near Eastern Department, and also, as it was called then, the Semitic Museum. And so he studied Assyriology, Biblical Hebrew, Akkadian, and was well on his way to being a Semitic philologist. And that's how he got his BA degree in 1889. Went home to Indianapolis, raised some money to be able to come back to grad school, and got his MA and PhD here under Lyon. And his dissertation was on case endings in Akkadian, nothing to do with Egypt. Lyon then sent him on a postdoc to Berlin for 3 years, and that's where he met the great German Egyptologist, learned hieroglyphs, learned the different phases of the language, came back to Harvard and was a lecturer for a year, thought he'd had it made, and there was no money to keep him. So he was quite despondent. He was living down by Radcliffe at the time on Walker Street, back then Wallace Street. And finally, he got a letter from Berlin saying, we're forming a commission in Cairo to publish books on the catalog, the Cairo Museum collection. We'd like you to be the American representative. And having been trained in Egyptology now, he said, sure, I'll do that for a year. It's a real job. And he stayed for 40 more years.
Amazing. And one of the people that is a large character in his life is Phoebe Hearst. And I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about who she was and how she really shifted the course of his career.
Sure. So if you don't know the name Phoebe Hearst, she's the mother of William Randolph Hearst, the Rupert Murdoch of his time, newspaper magnate. But she was a great philanthropist and was supporting the University of California, Berkeley. So Reisner's out in Cairo, and suddenly, a guy who couldn't find a job has 3 job opportunities all at once. Number 1 was Assyriology at Yale. He could go home and be a professor. Number 2, the Germans wanted him back in Berlin as an Assyriologist to publish more cuneiform texts in the collections of the Berlin Museum. And then in Cairo, he met Phoebe Hearst, and she was looking for archaeologists to dig all over the world, in this case in Egypt, to enrich the collections at Berkeley. And he thought, why not? I'll take a right turn in my career, try something completely new. There's too much plunder going on. I think I can apply my meticulous method and bring some order to archaeology. And she's willing to pay me to learn on the job. So why not? Well, I'll sign this 5-year contract for Phoebe Hearst and I'll become an archaeologist.
Amazing. I love that. You've mentioned some of the cutting edge approaches he brought to the field. What are some examples of things that he pioneered and laid the foundations for?
Great question. So archaeology around 1900 is not what it was today, of course. And he started slow. He brought in some British colleagues who had a little more experience. But before you knew it, he had devised survey methods where he laid the men across the desert and they would do a trial excavation and then take one step forward and do another. And eventually for miles, you would learn the lay of the land and the geological strata and know what you've got in terms of archaeological survey. He also brought in the concepts of documentation. So Flinders Petrie, the British archaeologist, preceded him just a bit in terms of developing archaeology, but Reisner took it further. So photographic documentation, photograph the site before you start, photograph the finds afterwards, every stage of the work, keep numbering systems, log books, register the finds, small, big, even the human remains were getting attention at this point, excavation diaries eventually. And he trained the Egyptian workmen in the so-called skill positions. So they weren't just clearing debris, but they were managing accounts. They came to do all the photography, manage the digs, handling loans and other aspects of the excavation. So it was a team effort, and he delegated the authority in that way.
One of the things that was really interesting to me is that he excavated at 23 different sites in Egypt, Nubia, modern-day Sudan, and Palestine. Was that usual for archaeologists of the day, or that seemed very prolific?
Absolutely. It's the ups and downs and the financial fundraising that I think determined where he ended up at times. So he worked at lesser-known sites until Giza became available, and he was one of 3 foreign missions granted permission to work there. Then money started to run out, and the British government said, we're going to raise the Aswan Dam, and that means that in the Sudan to the south, things are going to flood. Would you like to be hired by us to go do the survey and salvage archaeology down there before everything is submerged? And this was a financial rescue for the project. So he said yes, and that got him interested in Sudanese archaeology, and he went back year after year after that. In the meantime, when there were opportunities, he would jump. Sometimes plunder was going on at a site, so he would then be called in to try to dig it responsibly. After a while, he got tired of working with the British in the Sudan, and so he took David Gordon Lyon up on his offer for work in Palestine at Samaria, and he did 2 seasons. And so that's the only time he left Egypt or the Sudan to work somewhere else. So sometimes it's money, sometimes it's not getting along so well with your overlords, and sometimes it's great discoveries. But most of the time it was the Museum of Fine Arts Boston that was paying the bills, and then he came back on occasion to teach at Harvard and was paid for it when he did that.
That makes sense. What are some of the major discoveries that his digs brought to light, and which of those items can we still go and visit here today in Cambridge and in Boston?
Oh, great question. So on, I think, that table, there should be a color photo with some of the superstars all montaged together, but there are great things. He's best known for the history of the Old Kingdom, or the Pyramid Age, so about 2,500 BCE or so. Great royal statuary has come from there. Half of it you can see in the Cairo Museum, half of it in the Museum of Fine Arts. Objects of daily life, ceramics, stone vessels, incredible texts and stele with historical information and economic data. In the Sudan, colossal statues of Nubian kings, and uncovering the Nubian pyramids down there of kings that we didn't even know where their burial places were at the time. A lot of that material went to Khartoum, and a huge tragedy is that that museum has recently been looted in the Civil War, and I don't know if that material will ever be recovered again. So that is a huge tragedy. Half of it is also, again, in the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and there was a time when there was a Nubian gallery. Now a lot of the objects are out on loan. I hope eventually the MFA will create another Nubian gallery. It's the greatest Nubian collection outside of what was the Khartoum collection and is no more. So gold jewelry, wonderful ceramics and stone vessels and objects of daily life, important hieroglyphic inscriptions, royal statuary, private statuary, large and small. The list goes on and on.
One of the things that also struck me was how much Reisner worked. He, I think, would be what we might call a workaholic today. And after getting to know Reisner for so long, through all of this research over 15 years, you said, do you have a sense of what drove him to work so hard?
Yeah. Historical research was his mantra, and he worked 7 days a week, hardly ever took a vacation, and sometimes expected that of his team too, which was not without its frictions. But it was really the historical research that drove him, and yet he was savvy enough to know that it was the great finds that kept the checks being written from the MFA. So trying to please all these masters, the scholarship and the intellectual part for the publications for Harvard, the great objects that with permission, with legal permission, came back to Boston to the MFA from the division of the finds. These were all important parts, important aspects. And I think he was excited to find a masterpiece too. He wouldn't just poo-poo the whole thing. But it was trying to form a coherent picture of Egyptian civilization that really drove him, and that's what kept him going.
Makes sense. You've alluded to this a bit, and I wanted to get to some of the drama that was in the book. There were so many different interpersonal conflicts, things happening every few chapters, it felt like. What are some of the interesting stories that you found as you were doing research?
Well, one discovery was what I call the Summer of Intrigue in 1905. This is when Phoebe Hearst says, "Can't support you anymore, I'm done," and left the whole project high and dry. He didn't even tell Mrs. Reisner because he was so upset about this and felt he was really leaving everyone in the lurch. His assistant was Albert Lithgow, another Harvard student, and his field assistant. Lithgow says, "I'm going to come back to Boston ahead of you. Let me talk to Harvard. Let me talk to the MFA. Maybe we can get them involved." Because this was the Hearst expedition at the time coming to an end. And then Reisner comes back a few months later, and this was not Lithgow's finest hour. It looked like Lithgow was saying, "Reisner's toast. Here's a whole expedition and a whole working setup. We can take it for the MFA. What do you think?" And so thanks to David Gordon Lyon, who kept daily diaries, we have the whole summer of 1905 with Reisner versus Lithgow, President Eliot, the MFA director, all of these angling to try to create a new expedition, but not lose their shirt in the process. So the MFA wanted great art. They didn't want to get stuck paying the bill for a bunch of potsherds. Harvard wanted the publications and the intellectual part of it, didn't want to compete with the MFA as if they were trying to make a second Egyptian collection. Lithgow was trying to pull the rug out from under Reisner and take over the dig. And David Gordon Lyon was trying to protect his protege and make sure he didn't get shafted in the process. Eventually, they worked it all out with a one-year contract that continued for another 40 years or so. So, and then everyone else went on to happy careers. Lithgow eventually left, went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and had a great Egyptological career, and they did great things at other sites. So it all ended well, but it was tense for a while.
Yes. You had mentioned publications, and that made me think about the amount of publications that were piling up as Reisner continued to excavate. Mm-hmm. He seemed to really be eager to excavate because he felt there was a window of time to get that done, and he could get to the writing a little bit later.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that? I'd be curious to know more.
I think it made sense at the time. He felt this is a special time here at the first half of the 20th century. Let's dig while the digging is good. Often you hear quotes back then saying, another 10 years or 5 years, there won't be anything left to find. That was not the case, of course. But that was his strategy. His predecessor, Flinders Petrie, would go and dig and then write the book on the boat home to England every summer. And that was just too fast, not enough time to digest for Reisner. So you could fault him in the other direction. He took too long to get some of the books out, but they were thoroughly interpretive volumes. The table of contents for his major Giza Necropolis volume is about 25 pages, just the table of contents. So that gives you an idea of the backlog that he eventually got out. He did produce about 18 monographs and countless articles, so it's not like he was slacking off. Mm-hmm. But he left a huge backlog, which is why the grad students in the audience here have plenty of work to keep them and me busy for generations to come.
One of the things, so thinking about how energetic he was and how many different things he was involved in, one of the sadder parts of the book and the more moving parts is as he aged, he started to lose his eyesight. And I felt this part of the book was especially moving because you talk about how his team rallied around him to help him continue on his work and how his attitude remained pretty upbeat, all things considered. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. By about the early 1930s, he was having terrible cataract problems. He had one surgery that was successful for a while but didn't last, and eventually he was almost completely blind. On one of the tables, maybe it's over there, you'll see a card that has white ink on black paper, and there are a lot of those floating around the records. That's because they flipped the contrast. It was easier for him to see white ink on black paper, and so a lot of that documentation happened that way. Apparently, he never complained, and he just kept on working. This was not going to stop him, and even doing his own typing. In fact, you need a code for the later letters because his fingers were often off by one key. So have you ever tried typing with your fingers off? You have to decipher a little bit, but he did the typing himself and kept on going, but right up until the end. Yeah.
And they made a special typewriter for him, right? A color-coded one?
Yep. His assistant, Evelyn Perkins, who was an amazing firecracker, spoke about 6 languages and was the gatekeeper at Harvard camp trying to protect him. She figured out all kinds of ways to put window shades up so the contrast was right and colored typewriter keys on his Remington typewriter so you could see them more clearly and to help any way that she could.
And sort of at that point in his life, he developed a new hobby, which I find particularly charming. He developed an interest in mystery novels. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about his interest in them and his approach to them.
Yeah. I'd love to know when he started. It's not quite clear, but this was his only avocation, was detective novels. Not the love interest kind, but the whodunit kind. And I think it was that deductive reasoning that interested him. And in these later decades, people would come to Harvard camp and read at the end of the day. So he would sit and get the stories read to him. And he enjoyed them very much. He built up a collection of about 2,000 of these. And while the objects, the antiquities, went to the Museum of Fine Arts, the collection of detective novels in his will were given to Harvard, and they're part of the Harvard Library. I rounded them up once, and I went out to the Harvard Depository one summer and spent several days photographing every title page of these. Why? Because he graded them. You could see A, B's, and C's, and occasionally comments by Evelyn Perkins in there. So I was trying to get inside his head and see which authors he enjoyed and how he marked these things. He was a pretty tough grader, I think. So.
And when I was a librarian in Widener, I stumbled across one, and I think the title was "The Corpse Wore a Wig." And I just thought, oh, these are very of their time. It was very fun.
Yes, Who Cut the Colonel's Throat is one that I can't forget.
Switching gears a little bit, though, I know you mentioned this and in the beginning of our talk. I think that in the book you do an excellent job of addressing the fact that Reisner is both very forward-thinking in many ways, especially in his approach to excavation, but he's also a man of his time, especially when it came to attitudes towards race. During an interview with the Harvard Gazette, you mentioned the concepts of ancient racism and modern racism in regard to Reisner, and I thought it was a really interesting way of unpacking that. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. I think his greatest difficulty was with the Nubian cultures. He couldn't quite wrap his head around the fact that there could be great indigenous Black African cultures, great civilizations, and he thought they must be wandering Libyans or Egyptians who'd gone south and colonized the area or something like that. It's to his credit that he was interested in human remains and treating the anatomy and bringing in bioarchaeologists as part of the archaeological process. Some of the others who came into work were interested in cranium size as indications of superiority and things like that. I don't think Reisner himself ever went in for that too much. But in terms of the colonialism of the times, the sort of Western approach, thinking this is our entitlement to excavate these cultures and hopefully have some of the great collections come home with us, and thinking mistakenly that indigenous modern Egyptians might not be interested in this. That's not the case. In fact, they were prevented from studying their own heritage in many ways. There's a great book about that by Donald Reed called Who's Pharaohs? Definitely worth checking out. So I think with the Nubians, that's a bit of a block, and he misinterpreted some of his excavations as a result of it. With the ancient Egyptians, less so. And I give him credit for being on the side of his modern Egyptians, the people in that team photo over there. He saw current Egyptian politics, I think, through their eyes, and saw the sort of upper echelons of Egyptian society in Cairo as being the enemy who would exploit these groups here who came from an upper Egyptian village and were his great workmen. So it's a more nuanced and more complicated issue. I think some of his contemporaries at the time were far more egregious in their racism. I wouldn't ascribe that to him. I think he comes to the defense of his Egyptians much more often. So that's why I think about ancient issues and modern issues and how it's a more complex problem than people are willing to give credit for. I constantly think of that phrase, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and I try to go cautiously and point it out where things have been misinterpreted, and we try to set the archaeological record straight, but at the same time appreciate what he and his contemporaries are doing, the first ones to dig these sites, to try to document them and preserve the legacy.
And that actually segues nicely into my next question because, despite these beliefs, as you mentioned, he seemed to really care about the men he worked with. If, someone was injured on the job, he took that very seriously. He would document what happened. He trained them, as you mentioned earlier, to have roles like taking many of the photographs that are part of the Giza archive right now. And even in his old age, they in turn cared for him. I wanted to segue a bit and talk about another project that you've been working on, the Arabic Excavation Diaries, and how it strives to create a more complete picture of the work being done at Harvard Camp by these men.
Yeah. One particular family provided the raises, or the foreman, for the dig, and it was passed on from father to son and uncles and brothers and things. And without that family, the expedition would not have functioned. They were running the show, taking the photographs, handling the accounts. And in the middle of one of the greatest discoveries, the tomb of Queen Hetepheres, the mother of King Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid, found in a 90-foot underground shaft with amazing finds inside. The main foreman at the time, Sayyid Ahmed Said, died of pneumonia at the time in the middle of this, and it was catastrophic. The men were just bereft, didn't know what to do. Reisner somehow held it all together, passed along the authority to eventually the sons. There were two brothers who took over and saw the expedition through, even to Reisner's illness and his death and beyond. And to their credit, they were keeping Arabic expedition diaries along with English diaries. And so we get this absolutely unique view of an expedition from the early 20th century through Egyptian eyes. So we love this project. There are 73 books for Egypt and Nubia, and they just give a unique perspective on the dig. There's no other expedition, not the Penn Museum, not the Metropolitan, that have anything like this. So we're trying to study these not only for what they tell us about the archaeology today, but about the Arabic handwriting and the dialect and the grammar. And we've got an international team going at it from all these different angles. It's a multi-year project, But we'll get there, and we've even used AI to transcribe the Arabic, handwritten Arabic into transcribed Microsoft Word Arabic, and then we'll move on to the English translations.
Wow, that's phenomenal. That's very cool.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about all of the things that he accomplished in his life. And in the book, you write that Reisner's influence on both Old World and New World archaeology cannot be overstated. And yet Reisner is often glossed over or even ignored when the founding fathers of the field are discussed. And I did take a look at Toby Wilkinson's recent book in 2020 on the Golden Age of Egyptology, and Reisner gets about 2 pages. And I'm wondering, why do you think he gets overlooked? What are your guesses?
Well, there were 2 great American Egyptologists back then. One was James Breasted at the Oriental Institute, now the Isaac in Chicago. He was world famous. He had written histories, translated texts, great speaker, and so he was on another level. Reisner was excavating, and while he found great stuff, and there are thousands of newspaper articles, don't get me wrong, he was a personality that way, but he wasn't in that echelon with Breasted in terms of writing the textbook that every history student would read back in those days. So I think that accounts for a little bit of the discrepancy there.
Makes sense. Yeah, and we do have some of those newspaper articles on this front table here, which are very fun to read. So you worked at the MFA at the Giza Archives as the Giza Archives Project Director from 2000 to 2011, and now you direct the Giza Project here at Harvard, which we've discussed. You were also the first Egyptology chair at Harvard since Reisner. So how do you see the relationship between your work and the work Reisner started over 100 years ago?
Well, there's a bit of a gap. It's about 86 years or so. But it's actually a great privilege. I grew up in this area, and all the visiting committee meetings would always say, well, the NELC department's great, but there's no Egyptology there. And looking across the river from the MFA, we pined for the days when Egyptology would be here too. So for me, it's been a great privilege trying to put Harvard back on the Egyptology map and Egyptology back on the Harvard map. So we have a monograph series. We have several of these projects. We have incredibly talented PhD students here as well now, and it's just wonderful to see all that happening. The position, the chair that I have is actually an Egyptology post, so I'm delighted that when I step down, there'll be another one, and the tradition will hopefully not have another 86-year gap between Egyptologists.
That's something he worked for so long and was never able to achieve in his lifetime, right?
Exactly, yeah.
I want to get back a little bit to your writing process. So you got to meet a lot of really interesting people throughout this process, including some of the descendants of the people who worked on this project. Can you tell us about some of the relationships that you formed?
Sure. Reisner had one daughter, and she never married, so that is a dead end there. But I did meet his brother's granddaughters, I think that works, yeah. And they had some wonderful letters. I've met descendants of many of the people who worked for him, and have made some great friends along the way, and that's been fantastic. And every once in a while, they turn up an amazing treasure, great documents or letters. So that's been just part of the process that makes biography writing so much fun. And stay in touch with those people is a privilege. They're all over the world too, and they've taught me an awful lot about their ancestors and where they've gone and what legacies and influences they have as well. So there are endless spin-off projects on these people that I hope to get to eventually.
Well, that leads me to my last question, and it's a bit of a question and a request, a hopeful request. So you mentioned that you still have a lot of material you could spin off. We also discussed how Reisner loves a good mystery novel. So I'm wondering, when might we get a George Reisner mystery series from you?
Wow. Great question. I'm taking suggestions. There are a lot of mysteries in his life. I mean, one is a tragic one, which is the suicide of his mother and how that affected his life. Not being a psychologist, I can only guess at that, but it's something he never mentioned for the rest of the time. So that's a mystery to me. Another mystery is, where are all the letters that his wife Mary must have sent home to her many brothers and parents? Somewhere, I hope, is an attic with a trunk full of all that incredible documentation. That's the major gap in the book, is not being able to give her more of a voice. So plenty of real mysteries, and then I'm sure we can make up some fictitious thoughts and have some fun too.
Well, I know he was a really compelling person to read about, and I would absolutely read a mystery series.
Excellent. Okay, you got mine.
Well, with that, I want to turn it over to the audience for questions, and Issa will help us. We'll get that microphone. Thank you.
Peter, it's a great book, and everyone should read it in all 1,000 pages of it. I enjoyed it tremendously. I want you to tell us more about Reisner's relationship to Harvard and the Peabody. How would you summarize that?
Yeah, great question. I think they looked at the Peabody as the anthropological repository. So sometimes human remains would come here. They wouldn't go to the MFA. Often, if there were extra ceramics and things like that that the MFA didn't need, they would come here. And we still have the task ahead of us to try to balance these two collections and get the data that's at the MFA over here to round out the Peabody collections data. One of his assistants was Ulrich Bates. Ulrich was quite a character and got interested in first Nubian archaeology and then Libyan archaeology. He became the Peabody Museum's first African archaeology curator. And he looked down his nose across the street at the Near Eastern Department of the Semitic Museum, said, I don't know what those guys are up to over there. I want nothing to do with them, which is odd because when Reisner came home, he was teaching over there, not over here, even though he was in correspondence with the Peabody directors. At one point, he made a great discovery and was sending by boat all of this material back to Boston, and the boat caught fire. And the fire didn't destroy a lot of these objects, but the water used to put out the fire did. And so there's tremendous correspondence here at the Peabody, all the legal insurance challenges of the stuff that didn't ever arrive that was meant to come here, and the cost and who's paying it, and sending his assistants back early to deal with this calamity and all of these things. So he was in touch with David Gordon Lyon across the street, with Peabody directors here, channeling a lot of the anthropological material here that is not at the MFA. So the two collections balance.
I just have a question because we spoke about how at the end of his life he starts to lose his sight, and people on the sites were helping him kind of navigate that. Did he die in Egypt itself? Where is he buried? Is that, since he didn't really have a legacy outside of his one daughter, where is he currently? I know it's kind of a morbid question, but he dealt with morbidity, so
Right. He dealt with cemeteries much of his life. Yeah, it's a sad story. In World War II, about 1941, he sent his wife and daughter home to the States, and he thought they would be safer there. And then his health went downhill. He came here for the last time in 1939 for his 50th commencement ceremony, and seems to have suffered some kind of stroke on the boat coming over, and his speech was maybe a little slurred. He got better, but eventually had other strokes and was bedridden up at the Harvard campsite at the Giza pyramids for the last year of his life. Couldn't talk, wasn't mobile. They took care of him as best they could, and then he died in 1942, and he's buried in the American Cemetery in Old Cairo. And in fact, just last February, there was a wonderful work by Nicholas Warner to restore the stone and the grave of Reisner. And some of the people in this room joined me in a little ceremony to celebrate that achievement. So there's photos and a video will be coming of that little ceremony. So yes, he's in Cairo, never saw his wife and daughter again. And that's where he's buried.
I'll have a follow-up to that. Another good for thinking. And so during that time, I'm assuming within that final year, they were trying to find his predecessor, for lack of a better term, for Harvard Camp. What happened to Harvard Camp once he passed away? Was it a full turmoil, chicken with their head cut off, trying to figure it out? Or was there a plan set in place for Harvard Camp to continue this important work post Reisner?
Great question. So he dies in 42. His secretary, assistant Evelyn Perkins, is still there. They have a smaller staff, and they tried to limp along and keep things going, tried to get that big publication of his finally done, and at the same time realizing things were coming to a close. And so they were trying to place the men in good jobs at other expeditions to take care of them and deal with the older ones, the younger ones in turn. Eventually, 1946 comes around, the war is over, and MFA curators can finally come out to Egypt and decide, what do we do? Do we keep going? Do we shut down? Do we create some kind of center or umbrella organization for American digs at Harvard Camp? Do we move Harvard Camp into Cairo? And they tried to do this and eventually said, I think it's time to shut down. So they closed the camp in 1947, packed up what remained, sent it to the Cairo Museum, sent the final shipments back to the MFA. But the kernel of that idea is what became the American Research Center in Egypt. That was founded in 1948. It's a thriving organization now that supervises and helps all of American Egyptology, archaeology going on in the country. So the kernel of ARCE, American Research Center, is Harvard Camp. But the buildings at Harvard Camp are no more. The area's been taken down, and it's a place you have to know where it is to enjoy that legacy and just think of everything that happened there, from great discoveries to challenges to fundraising issues to celebrities and politicians coming through and royalty coming for tea. If there aren't ever other questions, I would say please enjoy the rest of the food, enjoy the images, and my thanks to Susan again and the library staff, and thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. It's a pleasure to share.